Chapter 1. The lanterns of Candlemas. It was Candlemas Eve in St. Mildred's on the Green, a village so snugly tucked between misty hills and winding lanes that visitors often remarked it seemed to have been sewn into the countryside itself. Lanterns hung from every doorpost, glowing like little orbs of captured sun against the frosty dusk, and villagers bustled in thick coats and scarves, preparing for the annual lantern walk, a gentle, picturesque tradition that had outlived the memory of its original purpose. At the vicarage, the Reverend Nigel Forsyth stood on the porch, surveying the growing crowd with a pleased expression. His wife, Agnes, bustled inside, fretting over last-minute preparations for the tea that would follow the procession. Children wove between adults, holding paper lanterns shaped like swans, stars, and, in young Peter Woodham's ambitious case, a crooked replica of the church itself. There was a hum of good spirits, and the muffled crunch of boots over frostbitten grass. Among the villagers was Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her sensible navy coat and a knitted scarf of particularly vivid pink. She stood a little apart from the knot of excited mothers and jostling teenagers, her bright blue eyes moving restlessly over the scene, noting, as always, everything. She smiled and nodded as Mrs. Sims, the baker's wife, waved to her with flour-dusted gloves. The procession was just beginning to gather when a minor commotion started near the green. Mr. Pritchard, the retired station-master, was heard muttering crossly about young people with no respect, and a handful of faces turned curiously toward the disturbance. It was nothing at first, just a child's shriek of laughter, a sharp word from an embarrassed parent, until it became clear that something, or rather someone, was missing. Harriet Blackstone, a lively young woman of 20, had not returned from fetching her lantern from the church vestry. Her sister Edwina, flushed and breathless, hurried to the vicar with her worry. "She's not there, Reverend. I went to look. There's no sign of her. And the back door, the one to the woods, it's open." A small, sudden silence fell over the green. It was the kind of silence that spreads quickly in villages, thick with instinctive, unspoken dread. The Reverend cleared his throat uneasily. "I'm sure there's a simple explanation. Perhaps Harriet wandered off. Some small accident, perhaps." But already murmurs began to ripple through the crowd. Speculation, fear, a dozen wild ideas blooming like frost flowers in the minds of those gathered. Miss Marple's hands tightened briefly on the handle of her walking stick. She said nothing, but her eyes, sharp, knowing, lingered for a moment on Edwina's trembling hands, on Mr. Pritchard's scowling face, on the dark line of trees that bordered the churchyard. It was Candlemas Eve, and Harriet Blackstone had vanished. Chapter 2. Whispers Across the Green. The time the last lanterns were extinguished, and the Reverend had called for calm, the gentle order of St. Mildred's on the Green had crumbled into restless clusters of speculation. Tea and biscuits sat untouched inside the vicarage hall, their delicate aromas curling up into the rafters forgotten. Out on the Green, villagers huddled together in anxious knots, their breath misting in the chill air, trading theories like children swapping sweets. "She's eloped, mark my words," said Mr. Pritchard gruffly, tapping his walking stick against the frozen ground. "Pretty girl like that, bound to catch some young rascal's fancy." "Nonsense," Mrs. Sims snapped, her cheeks pink with indignation. Harriet's not the sort, and on Candlemas Eve no less. It's bad luck to travel before the day's through. Everybody knows that. Near the lantern stand, young Peter, Woodham's mother pulled him close by the sleeve, murmuring, "Poor Harriet. She always had that wild streak, even as a little thing. Remember when she nearly fell through the ice at Wintermere Pond?" And somewhere between these mounting conjectures, a quieter voice asked what no one truly wished to answer. What if it wasn't Harriet's choice to vanish? Inside the vicarage, a more subdued group had gathered. The Reverend and Mrs. Forsyth, Miss Marple, Edwina Blackstone, pale and trembling, Dr. Lionel Graves, summoned hastily from his supper, and Inspector Frank Craddock, who had been roused from his cosy fireside at the White Hart Inn. Inspector Craddock, a broad man with a dependable if unimaginative air, scribbled dutiful notes in a leather-bound book. He questioned Edwina gently, but with an undertone of impatience. Candlemas or no, he had half a mind to treat the whole thing as a lover's quarrel. "When exactly did you last see your sister, Miss Blackstone?" he asked, pen poised. "6:15, Edwina whispered. "She said she would fetch her lantern and meet me by the south porch. I waited and waited, and when she didn't come, I went to look. I found the vestry empty and the back door swinging open. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner with her knitting perched forgotten on her lap, glanced toward the vicar. "The woods," she said softly. "They border the churchyard, do they not?" Reverend Forsyth nodded, his face grave. Tangled place, quite overgrown. There's a path through it, but few use it now." Inspector Craddock pursed his lips. "We'll organize a search. No need to stir up hysteria, but the sooner we look, the better." He turned to the door briskly, issuing orders to a constable who had just arrived, red-faced and breathless. Villagers would be asked to join in pairs, lanterns in hand, combing the woods before the frost thickened and tracks were lost. Outside, the atmosphere had turned colder, not just in temperature, but in the way the villagers clung to one another, glancing nervously over their shoulders as if the darkness itself had shifted somehow, become a thing to fear. Miss Marple, standing now by the window, watched the first searchers set off. She noted, without drawing attention, the expressions worn by those gathered. Mr. Pritchard's scowling defiance, Mrs. Simms's trembling hands, the worried glances exchanged between the Woodham brothers, and Edwina Blackstone, sitting slumped in a chair, twisting a handkerchief into knots. "Poor child," Miss Marple murmured. "It is a terrible thing not to know." But even as she spoke, her keen mind was already cataloguing the village's reactions, measuring them against long decades of human observation. It was never just the deed itself that revealed the truth, she knew. It was the way people shifted and squirmed under the weight of it. The search parties disappeared into the woods like scattered fireflies, their lanterns bobbing against the heavy dark. And somewhere in the depths of the village night, Candlemas Eve held its breath. Chapter 3. Threads in the Frost. The woods yielded nothing that night but broken branches and the pale glint of frost. By midnight, the weary searchers returned, stamping their feet and blowing into their hands, faces drawn tight with frustration and fear. Inspector Craddock stood on the vicarage steps, thanking each returning pair with a gruff word of appreciation. and a firm reminder that no one should speculate aloud. He understood the nature of village life too well. Rumours, once let loose, could twist faster than any investigation could follow. Inside the vicarage, tea had been reheated and stiff fingers wrapped gratefully around warm cups. Miss Marple sat quietly near the hearth, her knitting once again abandoned. Instead she listened, not to the official reports delivered to the inspector, but to the unguarded fragments of conversation drifting from the tired villagers. Never did like the woods myself. Heard a fox scream once, thought it were a woman. No footprints, they say, but the ground's too hard. Might be just like her mother, poor soul. That last remark came from Mrs. Price, the wife of the village butcher, spoken in a low, scandalized whisper to Mrs. Sims. Miss Marple's ears, keen as ever, caught the words easily, though she gave no sign. She knew better than most that in villages the past was never really buried. It simply lay beneath the surface, waiting for a crack. Harriet's mother. Yes, there had been talk, years ago. An unhappy marriage, sudden departures, tears glimpsed at the market. But these old tales, half forgotten by most, lingered like stubborn ivy on a stone wall. Later, as villagers drifted homeward and the vicarage emptied out, Miss Marple found herself beside Edwina Blackstone, who remained curled, small in a chair, white-faced and staring into the fire. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "it must be a dreadful time for you. Would you mind if I asked a question?" Edwina blinked, as if dragged back from some deep, paralyzing thought. She nodded mutely. "I wonder," Miss Marple said, her tone casual, almost musing. "Did Harriet seem anxious earlier today? Distracted, perhaps?" Edwina hesitated. Her fingers, Miss Marple noted, picked constantly at the embroidery on her handkerchief. She was quieter than usual, Edwina admitted, not like herself. She said she needed to speak to someone after the lantern walk. She didn't say who. And did she seem afraid? Edwina paused longer this time. I thought, maybe. But Harriet never liked to show weakness. She would laugh at me if I worried. Her voice cracked slightly. Miss Marple gave her a comforting smile. "It's very helpful to know. Thank you, my dear." By the time Miss Marple made her way home through the dark lanes of St. Mildred's, her breath forming thin silver clouds in the cold night, she had much to consider. Harriet had arranged to meet someone that evening. Someone she hadn't told her sister about. And she had been afraid, not enough to run, but enough to betray herself in small ways. At her own neat gate, Miss Marple paused and looked up at the sky. The stars, distant and cold, winked between fast-moving clouds. Somewhere out there, Harriet's fate lay tangled with the secrets of a village that wore its innocence like a Sunday bonnet. Miss Marple smiled faintly, a sad, almost pitying smile. Villages, she knew, were never innocent for long. Chapter 4. Shadows of Suspicion. Morning broke cold and brittle over St. Mildred's on the Green. A pale sun strained against the mist, gilding the hedgerows with ghostly light. By 9 o'clock, Inspector Craddock had established a formal search party, and by 10, a name was already circulating among the villagers. A name spoken with grim satisfaction by some, and in reluctant murmurs by others. Frederick Tubb. Tubb was an outsider by village standards, though he had lived in a crumbling cottage on the outskirts of the woods for nearly 3 years. A broad-shouldered man with a scarred forehead and a tendency to drink too much at the White Hart Inn, he made his living doing odd jobs, hedge-cutting, stable-mending, roof-thatching. And it was no secret that respectable families preferred to hire others when they could. More damning still, Tubb had been seen lingering near the church the previous evening, scowling into the festive crowds with a sour, brooding air. "Mark my words, it'll be him," Mr. Pritchard announced at the bakery, banging a floury fist on the counter. "Always had a nasty look about him, he has." Mrs. Sims, arranging pastries in the window, nodded gravely. And Harriet, such a bright girl, she'd have never gone near him willingly, if he cornered her. She shuddered theatrically, letting the sentence trail into suggestion. At the vicarage, Inspector Craddock pressed Edwina Blackstone with further questions, though Edwina could offer little more. Harriet had mentioned needing to meet someone, yes, but never named a person. She had not expressed fear of Tubb specifically. Still, the inspector found himself willing to be guided by the simple instincts of the village. "That's the trouble with these cases, Miss Marple," he remarked as they stood briefly outside, the vicarage after the morning search concluded. "It's usually someone no one trusts to begin with. Bad character tells in the end." Miss Marple smiled mildly, her gloved hands folded neatly over the handle of her shopping basket. "Indeed, Inspector," she said, "bad character does often tell, though sometimes it tells far too easily for comfort." Inspector Craddock gave a brief laugh, missing the gentle caution in her tone. Frederick Tubb was brought in by noon, his thick coat buttoned up to his sheer neck, muddy boots leaving dark prints across the vicarage floor. He looked bewildered rather than angry, blinking against the brightness of the hall lamps. "I don't know nothing," he kept saying, voice rough and defensive. "Didn't see. The girl was just having a walk before going to the inn. Ask anyone." But the murmurs around the village only grew louder. His reputation, such as it was, outweighed any lack of proof. At the White Hart, old Mr. Hopkins, who fancied himself an authority on village matters, leaned across a sticky table and said to his companions, "What more do you need? A man like Tubb. It's only a question of time before he does something dreadful." Back in her own sitting room at Mead Cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire with a cup of strong tea cooling at her elbow. She stared into the flames, thoughtful. It was all too convenient, too quick. Villages were quick to find their villains, especially when those villains already wore their guilt on their faces. But Miss Marple had seen far too much of human nature to trust appearances. Somewhere, she was certain, behind the shouting certainty of the villagers, lay the quieter truth, and if one listened, really listened, it was nearly always the quiet truths that mattered most. Outside, the mist clung to the village green like a shroud, and Candlemas Day pressed on, heavy with unanswered questions. Chapter 5. The tiniest clue. The next morning dawned dull and grey, the sky pressing low over St. Mildred's on the Green like a sheet of dirty cotton. Frost still clung to the hedges, and the puddles on the cobbled lanes were crusted thin with ice. Inspector Craddock, dissatisfied with Frederick Tubb's confused denials, but lacking any solid evidence, had released him for the time being. This decision did not sit well with the villagers, who regarded Tubbs's continued presence among them with thinly veiled hostility. At the village shop, Mrs. Sims was seen speaking animatedly to Mr. Greaves the grocer, her voice sharp enough that even those browsing the tins of biscuits could catch snatches. "If the inspector won't act," she said, "it's up to us to be vigilant, for the safety of our daughters, of all of us." Meanwhile, Miss Marple, with her usual modesty, kept to the quieter paths. She was not one to storm about demanding action. Instead, she preferred to observe, and to notice the things that others, wrapped up in their righteous noise, missed. It was during a quiet stroll near the churchyard that Miss Marple found herself passing the vestry, the last known location of Harriet Blackstone. The building, with its mossy stones and ancient leaded windows, looked entirely innocent in the grey morning light. A constable had posted a rope across the vestry door, but no one was guarding it now. Pausing, Miss Marple allowed herself a brief glance through the window. The interior lay in muted shadows, the lanterns from the Candlemas preparations still stacked on the wooden benches. A few pieces of paper fluttered along the stone floor, posters advertising the lantern walk, nothing more. And yet, something caught her eye. Just beyond the threshold, almost hidden beneath the edge of the stack of lanterns, was a smear, faint but distinct once seen, a darkened streak against the pale stone. It was not blood. That would have been noticed immediately by the first searchers. No, this was something subtler, a fine, powdery black residue. Coal dust? Soot? Neither seemed entirely right. Miss Marple's mind ticked quietly as she considered it. In a village like St. Mildred's, coal dust was hardly uncommon. But why inside the vestry? And why near the lanterns, where few feet would have trod during the evening festivities? She turned away without drawing attention, making a mental note of the detail. Later that afternoon, over tea with Reverend Forsyth's wife, who, flustered and fretful, poured tea into cups already brimming, Miss Marple allowed the conversation to flow naturally toward the church's comings and goings. "So many visitors lately," Agnes Forsyth sighed. "Even for Candlemas. I can hardly keep track of everyone coming in and out. Lanterns to fetch, cloaks left behind, children dashing about." Miss Marple smiled sympathetically, knitting clicking gently. "It must have been quite chaotic. I imagine things might be misplaced easily in the confusion." "Oh, yes," Mrs. Forsyth said with a distracted wave of her hand. "We even had trouble with the new heating system. It kept puffing smoke into the vestry. A dreadful bother. Reverend said the chimney sweep hadn't done a proper job last time." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused for the briefest second before resuming their steady rhythm. Smoke, dust, ash, the powder in the vestry suddenly made perfect sense, but in a way far more troubling than a simple chimney failure. Someone had known of the vestry's faults. Someone had perhaps used the confusion, the smoke, the poorly maintained little room to hide something, or someone. It was not a proof yet. Not even a real lead by the standards of the police. But Miss Marple, with the sharp instincts of long practice, felt the tug of a thread she would not let go. Somewhere in the soot, in the lanterns, in the village's eagerness to point fingers, lay the truth. She only needed to tease it out, slowly, carefully, before whoever had woven the tangle struck again, and Miss Marple, smiling faintly over her cooling tea, had the patience of a spider at the centre of a very old and very knowing web. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. By the following day, St. Mildred's on the Green no longer felt like the placid village it had always pretended to be. There was something brittle in the air, something that cracked when two villagers passed each other on the narrow lanes. An unsaid suspicion, a doubt too pointed to voice. Inspector Craddock had issued a notice requesting villagers to report anything they might have seen, heard, or remembered from Candlemas Eve, no matter how trivial. It had been intended as a practical measure, but in practice it stirred old embers. The first to come forward, predictably, was Mrs. Weatherby, an elderly widow who missed nothing and embellished everything. She insisted she had seen Frederick, Tub lurking outside the churchyard, but under questioning admitted she had only glimpsed a large shape in the mist. "I felt it in my bones. It was him," she said firmly. A shaky statement, but enough to embolden others. Soon the vicarage was thick with whispered half-truths. Miss Marple, meanwhile, preferred a quieter method. She set about her usual errands, visiting the greengrocer, stopping at the post office, but listened carefully to every casual remark, every careless slip of the tongue. It was at the post office that she overheard a conversation that made her pause. "I tell you," muttered young Sally Peters to her friend behind the counter, "Harriet was arguing with someone just last week, loud enough you could hear from the road." "Who was it?" her friend breathed. Sally hesitated, glancing around nervously, and caught sight of Miss Marple, seemingly absorbed in examining a rack of picture postcards. "I'd best not say," Sally said in a lowered voice. "But it wasn't Tub." Miss Marple allowed herself a thoughtful frown as she tucked the information away. Later that afternoon, a different sort of confrontation unfolded at the White Hart Inn. Edwin Woodham, elder of the two Woodham brothers, had too much ale, and began boasting loudly at the bar about how he knew more about Harriet's affairs than anyone dared admit. When pressed, he became defensive, muttering about broken promises and spoiled chances. By evening, word of the outburst had made its way across the village. Mrs. Sims repeated it with relish at the bakery, Mrs. Price with solemnity at the church flower committee. Miss Marple, upon hearing it, simply nodded. Once, it fit a pattern she had long suspected. The truth was that Harriet Blackstone had not been the universally beloved figure the villagers now painted her to be. Young men had admired her, young women had envied or resented her. Harriet had stirred hearts and jealousy without perhaps understanding the full weight of what she had unleashed. Quietly, Miss Marple sought out Edwina that evening. She found the girl sitting alone on the vicarage lawn, arms wrapped tightly around herself, despite the cold. "My dear," Miss Marple said kindly, sitting beside her on the bench, "you mustn't feel obliged to protect anyone now. Sometimes holding on to secrets does more harm than letting them go." Edwina's lips trembled. She stared at her hands for a long time before speaking. "There were quarrels," she whispered. "People thought Harriet was leading them on. Some said cruel things behind her back. Edwin Woodham especially. He thought there was an understanding between them." And was there? Edwina shook her head fiercely. Harriet never wanted to marry anyone here. She said she was meant for better things. She wanted to go to London to be an actress. She laughed at Edwin when he proposed. She thought it absurd. Miss Marple patted her hand gently. It was becoming clearer. Beneath the gentle surface of Candlemas, Eve had swirled far more complicated currents. Ambition, bitterness, pride. And someone, it seemed, had let those emotions curdle into something deadly. As Miss Marple rose to leave, she looked once more across the village green, where the last threads of mist clung stubbornly to the hedgerows. The past was never dead in villages like St. Mildred's. It only slept, lightly, until disturbed, and now it had woken. Chapter 7. A New Discovery. 2 days after Candlemas Eve, when the village had begun to shift from fearful murmuring to grim resignation, a sudden jolt of news electrified St. Mildred's on the Green. It came, fittingly, from young Peter Woodham, whose enthusiasm for exploring the woods had not been dampened by the recent events. Early that morning, while his mother thought him at lessons with the Reverend, Peter and his dog Buster had ventured deep into the thickets behind the churchyard. Farther than the formal search parties had dared go. Miss Marple heard the commotion even before she reached the greengrocer's for her morning errands. A knot of villagers clustered at the corner by the bakery, their faces taut with a mixture of hope and dread. "They've found something," cried Mrs. Sims, her apron dusted in flour. "Out past the old boundary wall." Inspector Craddock arrived at the scene minutes later, grim-faced and efficient. Miss Marple, moving with her usual quietness, positioned herself nearby without drawing attention. Peter, pink-cheeked and panting, pointed eagerly toward a crumbling stone wall half swallowed by ivy. "There, sir." Buster was sniffing, and I saw it poking out the ground. Cautiously, constables cleared the area. After a few tense minutes, they unearthed a battered tin box, old and rusted, the kind once used to store tools or valuables. Inside were several items, wrapped in what appeared to be a torn length of silk scarf, a gold locket, a crumpled theatre, programme from London, a sheaf of letters, and chillingly, a woman's handkerchief embroidered with the initials HBA Gasp rippled through the onlookers. Inspector Craddock examined the contents grimly. "It's hers, no doubt about that, but why bury these things out here? No body was found, not yet, but the presence of Harriet's personal belongings, hidden away so deliberately, shifted the investigation sharply." Back in the vicarage, as the inspector and his men catalogued the evidence, Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting once again forgotten, in her lap. She had seen enough in her lifetime to understand the significance. The hiding of personal effects was not the action of a casual villain. It suggested fear, panic, perhaps even regret. "And there was something else?" Miss Marple asked, nay, as casually as if inquiring after the weather, whether she might see the letters. After a moment's hesitation, Inspector Craddock obliged, handing her one of the less stained ones. The handwriting was cramped but legible. It spoke of dreams, of escape to London, of auditions, of promises made by someone referred to only. As Miss Marple's mind flickered swiftly over the possibilities. It meant nothing yet, but coupled with the hidden box, It suggested that Harriet's disappearance had less to do with a simple village quarrel and more to do with a plan kept secret from those nearest her. Meanwhile, the villagers reacted as villagers always did, some with scandalized horror, others with grim satisfaction. "She was meeting someone," Mrs. Weatherby declared at the market. "A London man, no doubt, the kind you hear about in the Daily Mail." At the White Hart, Edwin Woodham slouched over his pint, muttering bitterly into the foam. Others watched him closely, gauging his anger, weighing their own suspicions anew. Miss Marple noticed it all. The stiffened backs, the furtive glances, the old resentments flaring up like dry straw. The discovery of the box had not solved the mystery. It had deepened it, and as Miss Marple wrapped her shawl tighter against the chill, she thought with a familiar, patient certainty the answers were there, in the forgotten resentments, the hidden ambitions, and the small revealing cruelties of ordinary people. She only had to wait. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test. The village of St. Mildred's on the Green wore its tension like a badly tailored coat. Too tight, too obvious. By the evening following the discovery of the tin box, everyone had a theory, a certainty, and a preferred villain. Inspector Craddock, though professionally cautious, seemed increasingly convinced that Edwin Woodham was at the heart of it. The dear young man's bitterness, his public outbursts, his proximity to Harriet during the weeks leading to her disappearance, all lined up neatly enough. Yet for Miss Marple, it was too neat. She had lived too long, seen too many tangled hearts, to believe in convenient villains. Real guilt, she knew, rarely shouted. It hid, it smiled, it blended in. And so, with the kind of quiet purposefulness that few noticed, Miss Marple devised a small test. The opportunity came on the evening of the Candlemas ball, an event hastily repurposed into a sombre gathering at the village hall, meant to lift spirits, but attended with an air of forced gaiety. Miss Marple, wearing a soft grey dress and an unobtrusive string of pearls, moved through the room like a wren among larger birds, listening, smiling, unobtrusive. She engaged each of the key figures in seemingly innocent conversation. Edwin Woodham, still brooding and red-eyed, Frederick Tubb, awkward and sullen, even Mrs. Sims, whose tongue had wagged too freely of late. And then, casually, she approached Mr. Dennis Langton. Mr. Langton was the new schoolmaster, mild, well-spoken, with neat cuffs and a bashful manner. He had settled into village life with such little disturbance that most forgot he had come only 6 months prior. But Miss Marple, who knew the delicate ripples of village society, had noticed things. How Harriet had often lingered at the schoolhouse, Gates laughing. How Langton had been unusually quick to defend her reputation when the gossips began to hiss. How he had flinched, just slightly, when the locket and letters were produced from the tin box. They danced for a few minutes. Gentle, almost comical shuffle. And Miss Marple spoke brightly about London, about theatres, about young girls with stars in their eyes, about how dangerous the city could be for a trusting soul. At first, Langton laughed along politely, but as Miss Marple continued, slipping subtle little barbs into her chatter, mentions of broken promises, of dashed hopes, of secrets hidden away, the colour began to drain from his face. His hand resting lightly on Miss Marple's back, grew damp with sweat, and when she casually remarked, "I dare say even a kindly young man might find himself tempted to lead someone on if he thought no harm would come of it," Langton stumbled. Just a slight misstep, a loss of rhythm, an instant of wide, guilty eyes. Miss Marple, guiding him deftly back into step, smiled up at him as if she had noticed nothing. But inside, she knew she had found it, the guilt that did not shout, the guilt that trembled quietly just below the surface. Later, as she sat with Inspector Craddock near the makeshift punch bowl, Miss Marple spoke mildly. "Forgive an old lady's interference, Inspector, but I believe you ought to have a word with Mr. Langton. Nothing heavy-handed, you understand. A quiet word about truth and consequences." Craddock looked sceptical, but knew better than to disregard her advice entirely. Miss Marple sat back, sipping her weak tea with the air of a woman who had merely commented on the weather. The village whirled around her, all bright paper decorations and brittle laughter, but under it all, the quiet, inexorable turn of truth had begun. And soon the real story of what had happened to Harriet Blackstone would emerge, like a crooked shadow thrown against the light. Chapter 9. The Gentle Unmasking. It was the morning after the Candlemas ball, when Inspector Craddock, following Miss Marple's quiet suggestion, invited Mr. Dennis Langton for a private word at the vicarage. It was handled delicately. No accusations, no formal charges, just a polite, pressing invitation that a man of Langton's good standing could hardly refuse. Langton arrived looking worn, his neat jacket crumpled, his collar askew. He had the air of a man who had not slept. Miss Marple was already there, sitting quietly by the fire, her knitting basket at her side, though her hands were still. The constable stationed outside the room added no pressure, only the calm, inescapable weight of order. Inspector Craddock began by asking about Langton's acquaintance with Harriet Blackstone. "A friendship," Langton said quickly. "Nothing more. She was young, eager. I encouraged her dreams, perhaps more than I should have." He swallowed. But there was nothing improper. Miss Marple's voice, when it came, was soft and conversational, as if they were discussing the spring planting. But there were promises, weren't there, Mr. Langton? Perhaps made in kindness, or vanity. Langton stiffened. "I never—" He stopped, visibly gathering himself. "It was innocent. I told her I had contacts in London, friends in the theatre. She believed I could help her." "And did you help her?" Langton's hands twisted in his lap. His gaze dropped to the faded carpet. "I meant to," he said at last. "At first, but then it became complicated. She spoke of leaving the village immediately, within days. She wanted money, introductions. She thought—" He hesitated, painfully. "She thought I would go with her." Miss Marple's eyes, sharp and compassionate all at once, did not leave his face. "And when you refused—" Langton's voice dropped to a whisper. "She became furious, said she would tell everyone that I had seduced her, that I had ruined her." There was a long silence. Only the clock on the mantelpiece ticked, loud and solemn. Inspector Craddock leaned forward. "And what happened that night, Mr. Langton?" Langton's shoulders sagged, the fight leaving him. "She sent a note. asking me to meet her at the vestry before the lantern walk. She said we must settle matters privately. I went. We argued. She said terrible things. She threatened to ruin me, my position, everything. He covered his face with his hands. I didn't mean to hurt her. I only tried to stop her shouting. I grabbed her arm. She slipped, fell, hit her head against the stone bench. Miss Marple's hands tightened momentarily in her lap. "And afterward?" she asked gently. Langton's voice was almost inaudible. I panicked. I thought, if they found her there, they'd believe the worst. So I hid her things, dragged her into the old path by the woods. I thought no one would find her. Inspector Craddock rose slowly from his chair, signalling to the constable. Langton made no move to resist. As they led him away, Miss Marple remained seated, staring into the low burning fire. It was as she had long suspected, not a crime of monstrous evil, but one of weakness, of panic, of the desperate mistakes made when pride and fear overcame better judgment. And poor Harriet, bright, reckless Harriet, had paid the final price. When Craddock returned to the room, he paused by Miss Marple's chair, his voice low. "You were right, as always, Miss Marple. How did you know?" She smiled faintly, but there was no triumph in it, only sadness. "It is quite simple, Inspector. Guilt shows itself not through anger or bluster, but through fear, through the way a man steps when he believes the ground might give way beneath him." She rose, gathering her knitting. And of course, dear Harriet's ambitions were too large for St. Mildred's. Someone promised her the world, and when he could not deliver it, pride and desperation did the rest. She paused at the doorway, looking back toward the cold hearth. "In the end," she said softly, "it is not wickedness that destroys so many, but cowardice." Outside, the mist had lifted at last, revealing the village in stark winter sunlight. But for the people of St. Mildred's on the Green, the shadow of Candlemas Eve would linger far longer. Chapter 10. Candlemas Ashes in the Days That Followed. Dennis Langton's quiet arrest. The village of St. Mildred's on the Green slowly resumed its rhythm, but the cadence had changed, softened, as if a bell once struck too hard now sounded more distantly. Official statements were made with cautious decorum. Inspector Craddock issued a brief announcement, omitting the more sordid details. The newspapers, mercifully distracted by larger events elsewhere, paid the case only a passing mention. Local schoolmaster arrested in connection with young woman's disappearance. Harriet Blackstone's body was found soon after, concealed, beneath a bramble of winterthorn deep beyond the vestry woods. The blow to her head had been fatal, death swift. She was buried quietly, without the grandeur she had once dreamt of. The church pews half full, with villagers who wore black not only for Harriet, but perhaps for the small guilty knowledge that they had never truly understood her. Miss Marple attended the service, sitting primly near the back, her gloved hands folded in silent prayer. She neither cried nor smiled, but listened carefully to the murmur of the hymns, the soft sniffling, the polite coughing, all the tiny sounds that made up human sorrow. Afterwards, as the mourners drifted away into the mist, Miss Marple remained, standing at the lych gate, gazing out over the slumbering village. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and wood smoke. Beside her, Reverend Forsyth adjusted his spectacles with a sigh. "A tragedy, Miss Marple, a waste of a young life, and also—" He paused, searching for the right word. "So unnecessary." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes," she said quietly. "It always is." The Reverend hesitated. "How did you see it?" "Before the rest of us." She smiled faintly, with no triumph in it. "One learns, after many years, Reverend, that wickedness is rare. Foolishness, selfishness, pride, those are far more common. Harriet was foolish in her ambitions. Mr. Langton was foolish in his vanity, but it was fear of shame, fear of exposure, that turned missteps into tragedy." The Reverend bowed his head. "We must pray that we learn from it." Miss Marple's eyes, still clear and piercing despite their gentleness, rested a moment longer on the crooked rows of cottages, the quiet lanes. Villages, she thought, were like old teapots, cracked, much mended, but beloved. They survived everything, ayew, storms, scandals, sorrow, but they never truly forgot. As she turned to go, she paused to pluck a small candle stub from the ground, a remnant of the lantern walk, half buried in the frost. She cradled it in her palm a moment, then tucked it into her pocket. A small reminder that even the gentlest lights could be snuffed out, and that human frailty, not monstrous evil, was the shadow most often lurking in the quietest of places. Miss Marple made her way home through the thinning mist, her step light, her mind, as always, quietly at work on the great, intricate puzzle of human nature. And so the village of St. Mildred's, with its tidy hedges and hidden sorrows, folded the tragedy of Candlemas Eve into its history. A history that Miss Marple, wise and watchful, would never cease to understand better than anyone else ever could.